Hey folks, I thought I would throw together a quick video on fire suppression and fire dynamics in the West, right? Millions and millions of acres are being lost. People are dying. Um, Timber industry is taking a big hit. Um, Communities are really suffering. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit more about fire dynamics in the West. So imagine, if you will, we have a little compartment here called fuel, right? And this is the stuff that burns. This is the dead plant material, right? Most plant growth just winds up dead on the forest floor, the grassland, what have you. So that fuel comes from plant growth. Plant growth, right? Primary production. That's what we're talking about here. Primary production. Most of that dies, of course, and creates fuel. So we create a little system here in which more plant growth means more fuel, and that's what we mean by this little plus sign right here. So more plant growth leads to more fuel. Of course, the more fuel there is, the more likely it is that fire will burn. So that leads to more frequent fires. The more fuel you have, the more frequent your fires are. It also means that the more fuel you have, the bigger your fires. Fire intensity and fire extent. All right, we talked about these features of any disturbance: a disturbance frequency, disturbance intensity, and extent, which is the area. Now, fuel, of course, right? We just said the more fuel you have, of course, the hotter your fires will be and the bigger an area they will tend to cover. Now, there's a really important thing going on in fire systems, and that is what happens is, right, the more often you have fires, right, the less fuel there is, because once you have a fire, some of the fuel is gone. So fire has a negative effect on fuel load. Similarly, when you have big fires, as fire gets hotter, it burns up more fuel. Of course, when fire gets really hot, it kills things and can reduce some plant growth, but this is kind of a mixed bag. Sometimes it does one thing, sometimes it does another. But a critical step in this is that the more often you have fires, then you have a really strong indirect effect, and I'm making this dashed line, make a little key down here. A solid line is a direct effect. And I'm just going to put in a couple of especially important dashed lines, and these are indirect effects. An indirect, indirect. If I could only spell, right? Indirect effect. And an indirect effect is just the result of more than one direct effect. Right? So the more often you have fires, the more you reduce the fuel, and so the less fuel you have, the less intense the fires become. So this is a really strong relationship right here. The more often you have fires, the less intense they become. And those are the four natural processes that I wanted to diagram here. Now, when you listen to the podcasts, if you haven't already, you'll learn that some of the key elements driving increased fire in the West, of course, is chief among them is climate change. And we'll specify a little bit more: global warming. this makes the fire season longer. And so when you have a longer fire season, of course, you have that just a fire season means, hotter, drier periods for longer periods of time. And that just creates greater opportunity. The longer fire season causes it to be more likely that you're going to get fires. So that's a direct effect. Because of the extra energy put into the system, that means that the fire intensity, things are drier, and so you're going to get more intense fires over bigger areas. Let's put this in a box because this is climate change due to humans, and so I'll put the things caused by humans in boxes. Another thing that reduces fire is timber harvest, right? A lot of millions of acres out west are in federal lands, and it's used by the Forest Service. The Forest Service leases it for very low money to people to come in, for timber companies to come in and cut the trees and sell them for timber. So timber harvest, right, is a way to remove some of that fuel. Of course, what people who cut those trees down to sell them, they want the big standing live trees. That's what they want. And depending upon how it's harvested, if they follow good practices, they can also reduce the amount of fuel. They can reduce the amount of dead stuff. Unfortunately, what can happen also is that the big logs are taken and all the dead branches are left behind. And all of those dead branches simply add to the fuel. So the effect here may be negative. It also, under good management, it is negative. Sometimes it actually makes the problem worse by leaving behind what they call scrap or slash. When they leave that behind, then they're actually just creating fuel. A bigger problem in all of this is fire suppression. Make a nice big box for that. Fire suppression. So, right, when Europeans colonized North America, they set up permanent farms and permanent homes, and so they wanted to, they saw fire as a dangerous thing, and so they immediately worked to suppress fires and to prevent Native Americans, well, from living, but also from setting fires that they used to manage the landscape. It got really bad following the First World War, and then in the 30s and 40s, when there was a lot of manpower, literally men looking for work, coming home from World War II, coming home from World War I, and of course during the Great Depression, they were all put to work putting out fires. So there was a huge negative impact on fire frequency. They did not want fires to happen. This was also part of the thought was, well, we don't want to burn up those trees. We don't want to burn up the trees because we want to sell the trees. So let's keep the fire out so that we can cut down those trees and sell them. And so part of the plan here was, if we want to sell the trees, we can't let them burn, so we got to suppress it. We've got to suppress forest fires to keep people safe. Of course, you don't want homes and towns to burn up, but also to protect the valuable timber. And so this fire suppression by the U.S. Forest Service, which is in the Department of Agriculture. It's important to sort of understand that context, right? The Forest Service is in the Department of, Agriculture, because they're in the business of selling trees, among other things. And so this element right here was really important. So fire gets suppressed. That means with fewer fires, the fires aren't burning up any of the fuel, but you still have plant growth increasing the fuel. And so eventually, when you get a fire, it's enormous because you have lots and lots of fuel. If you can increase fire frequency, that reduces the amount of fuel. When you reduce the amount of fuel, that means this fuel isn't making the fire as intense or as big, and so you reduce fire intensity and extent. So the idea is to have the right amount of fire on the landscape, a natural amount of fire on the landscape, to prevent fires from getting out of hand. And that's what the US government has actually been in the business of doing, suppressing fires. Over the past 20, 30 years, forest scientists have realized, yeah, this is a really bad thing. People have realized this problem. And they say, we can't do this. Our forests are changing. They're not the forests we want them to be. And as a result, we've got to stop doing this as much. But of course, that's a tricky situation because you still have people who want to cut down the trees and sell them. And so these folks make the argument that, well, if we cut down the trees, we can actually reduce that fuel. And they have a good point. It's important to make sure that there's enough fire and enough harvest so that this fuel doesn't build up. I think that's it. Another really important component, and really why this is in the news so much, is that people are dying because of the intensity and extent of these fires. And so the more intense the fire and the bigger the fire, the more it leads to suffering. So we'll have, call this suffering. So this is the loss of lives. This is the loss of property. And so, and this is the third part of the equation because, as you heard about in the videos, population sizes have skyrocketed out west and has gone up out west. And so people are simply living more in the wildland, urban wildland interface, as it's called. So with increasing population sizes, hotter fires lead to more death and property loss. And I guess we'll stop there.